Psalm 21, verse 21. Mixing metaphors. Deliver, O God, my soul from the sword, my only one from the hand of the dog. Psalm 21, verse 21, Douay Rheims. Evagrius of Pontus was a highly regarded churchman living in Constantinople and serving as archdeacon under Bishop Nectarius, having previously served under St. Gregory Nazianzus and even participated in some capacity at the Council of Constantinople in AD 381. Yet beneath the surface lurked great temptation, and he found himself attracted to a wealthy, married noblewoman, who herself reciprocated the attraction. One night he had a dream where he was shackled and condemned, and in the dream he vowed to leave Constantinople. Upon waking, he deemed the vow to be binding and made good on his word, journeying to Jerusalem and the monastery of Melania the Elder. However, despite his initial good intentions, he was slothful in leaving his old life behind, carrying with him the same passions and weaknesses. He found himself ensnared in the same temptations and began visiting women. It was then that he was afflicted with a sickness and fever that lasted for half a year, which Melania the Elder suspected was a sign from God. Through this, Evagrius promised to finally make good on his intention to become a monk, and journeyed deeper into the deserts of Egypt, where he was able to purify his heart and mind, and wrote works for those who struggled with the same demons that had haunted his life. Reflecting on this passage from the Psalms, he wrote, quote, "And Simeon says to Mary, and a sword shall pierce through your own soul also." The sword, therefore, is a blameworthy temptation calling the soul to unbelief in God, or falsely called knowledge, or an impure thought dragging the soul into sin, which is what happens to those who wish to succeed in the ascetic life. Evagrius of Pontus, Scholia on the Psalms, 21, Scholium 9. Evagrius had fled from the world and into the farthest reaches of the desert, but even here temptations lurked, and he did not fully escape the lure of these particular carnal temptations until about 3 years before his death. The swords that surrounded him never really left, and in this vale of tears we will never rise completely above all temptation, as even our Lord was tempted in the wastes of the desert, both literally and in the agony of his passion. Thus Sirach wisely says, quote, "Son, when thou comest to the service of God, stand in justice and in fear, and prepare thy soul for temptation. Humble thy heart and endure, incline thy ear and receive the words of understanding, and make not haste in the time of clouds." Sirach chapter 2, verses 1-2, Douay Rheims. The psalmist continues with his prayer for deliverance, for whereas in the previous passage he implored the Lord to be his defense in general, he now seeks for deliverance in particular, from the sword. The Vulgate has phramia for sword, which was originally a term the Germanic tribes used for spears, but which came to be more or less synonymous with the usual term gladius by the time of St. Jerome. This sword is arrayed against his soul, which in some sense stands in for his life as a whole, but in another sense is not necessarily concerned with the physicality of the situation preeminently. Rather, he sees his soul, the deepest and most inner part of him, as in danger from the machinations of his enemies, both in terms of their warring against him, but more poignantly in the temptation to despair that arrays itself against his soul, the temptation to unbelief that Evagrius speaks of, the impure thought that sets itself against God's promises. The sword of man can only pierce the body, but this very same sword threatens his immaterial soul, for just as the temptations of the body can lead to the ruin of the soul, so the temptation to despair because of the seeming victory of his enemies can also lead to destruction. In the second clause of this passage, he expands through the parallelism upon the first, this time shifting the metaphor of the sword to that of a dog. Dogs were mentioned earlier in verse 17 as having encompassed him, but now there is just one dog, having power over his only one, which corresponds to the soul of the first clause. He sees his soul from outside of himself, as it were, for it is not merely his soul, but his only one, the only thing he possesses, and which is now within the power of the dogs which have encompassed him. Yet here there is a somewhat odd turn of phrase, for his only one is not said to be in the power of the dog, nor something like the paws or the jaws of the dog, but rather the hand of the dog, which is not a term generally applicable to dogs. Quote, "So that you may know that dogs are most aptly cited in comparison to such men, he used the words, from the hand of the dog, a phrase appropriate rather to a man than to a dog. Cassiodorus, Explanation of the Psalms 21:21. The seemingly mixed metaphor has a purpose, for just as swords exist through the industry of man and the application of his mind to its creation, so the term hand denotes not only power or control, but also has implicit in it the same rationality and the delineation of determined action. There is thus the worst of both worlds here, for those who seek his life and his soul have the brutishness and ravening of a wild dog, yet apply that bestial power with considered malice and forethought. They tear at him like a beast, but with the studied calculation of a man, marrying rage and rationality into the hardness of malice and iniquity which pierces like a sword. His only one thus lies open to such seething malice, his soul at their mercy, which will be no mercy at all unless the Lord intervenes on his behalf. But since he is considering his soul from a distance, so to speak, there is prophetic import, for in our Lord the soul and the only one is none else but the Church. Quote, "Deliver my soul." He is now asking for deliverance for the Church, which in his eyes is the only one, the Catholic Church. Thus we are to realize by this word denoting unity that he has rejected new teachings and the counsels of the wicked. Cassiodorus, Explanation of the Psalms 21:21. It is thus not merely poetic diction which employs this term, but a prophetic anticipation of the Church springing forth from Christ's side on the cross. This deliverance is prayed for within the cloak of prophetic ecstasy, yet brought to fruition in our Lord's promise that the gates of hell will not prevail against her. As a prophetic insight into Christ's passion and death, he was not delivered from the sword as the world would understand it, for he truly died upon the cross. But in the resurrection he was vindicated and glorified, delivered from death forever, and the Church as his mystical body shares in that deliverance. The dogs of heresy and schism cannot break her, even though they may bark with all their might, for the hand of the dog is broken in that the machinations of men and of demons cannot overcome Christ and his Church. Those who cleave to Christ within his Church thus share in his soul, as it were, for in the bonds of charity they come to have one heart and mind. And within this bond of unity the dog's bark is worse than its bite, the sword has no power to pierce, and the terror of death is defeated and broken forever, for Jesus Christ has already delivered them through his suffering. Quote, "Let everyone think this even of their own soul, that they should hate the private affection within it, which is undoubtedly temporal, and let them love in it that communion and fellowship of which it was said, they had one soul and one heart toward God. For in this way your soul is not your own, but belongs to all the brothers, whose souls are also yours, or rather, whose souls together with yours are not souls, but one single soul, the unique soul of Christ, which the Psalms pray may be delivered from the hand of the dog. From that point, one very easily arrives at the contempt of death." St. Augustine, Epistle 243. To be joined together with Christ's soul as his only one is to be joined also to his passion, to partake of his suffering so as to share in his life. Our Lord in his incarnation did not preclude himself from temptation, but faced it head-on, staring down both the sword and the dog, knowing that the grace of God is sufficient to overcome all temptation. These assaults of the world, the flesh, and the devil, in the myriad temptations we daily face, when overcome by the assistance of God's grace, become a means of merit and sanctification. Without the threat of the sword, our souls cannot be tested and proved, and without the growl of the dog, we would think ourselves sufficient without the help of God's mercy and grace. And instead of cultivating the humility that is necessary to resist and overcome temptation and the devil, we would inevitably fall into pride and thus fall prey to the very snare which keeps the devil and his angels eternally bound. Evagrius in his cell in the desert still faced the onslaught of the demons, both those from without and perhaps even more those from within, but nevertheless overcame them in the long years of his contest against sin, during which he is said to have spoken, "Take away temptations, and no one will be saved." Deliver, O God, my soul from the sword, my only one from the hand of the dog. Psalm 21, verse 21, Douay Reims.